Welcome to Love and Leadership, the podcast that helps you lead with both your head and your heart, plus a bit of humor. I'm Kristen Sharkey, a leadership coach and facilitator.
And I'm Mike Sharkey, a senior living and hospitality executive. We're a couple of leadership nerds who also happen to be a couple.
Join us each week as we share our unfiltered opinions, break down influential books, and interview inspiring guests.
Whether you're a seasoned executive or a rising star, we're here to help you level up your leadership game and amplify your impact.
Hello, and welcome back to Love and Leadership. I'm Kristen.
And I'm Mike.
And today is our part 2 Leadership Book Club LBC. Episode for Dare to Lead by Brené Brown. So if you have not listened to part 1, which aired 2 weeks ago, I highly recommend that you go back and listen to that first. But otherwise, we are going to pick up where we left off at section 4 of part 1.
Shame and empathy.
Shame and empathy. So this chapter opens with a very raw story of how Brené had like a crazy book tour and all this stuff lined up, and she ran into a glass wall
while recording the book.
While recording the audiobook.
Yeah, and she put herself through some crazy training regimen to get into shape for the book tour, because it can be, I'm sure it's very emotional.
Very grueling and physically grueling.
And the sound engineer was like, "Can you take off your dangle earrings? I can hear them." She's, "Oh, so sorry." And as she's getting up to do it, she ran straight head first into a 6-inch plate glass wall, and everything came apart for her.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so she talks about like how she got a severe concussion.
Yeah. She's also from Texas, and she's, I think, from German descent, and the mentality is suck it up. And that's not necessarily what she would say to somebody else, but that's what she was telling herself. Just suck it up, power through. Don't be weak. And her behavior changed, and she started getting very aggressive and snapping at everybody. And they're like, okay, something's really wrong.
Yeah. And it turned out, I mean, she needed to basically take over a month off. She had to cancel a bunch of speaking dates. She had to throw her regimen out the window. Then she talks about like all the shame she felt by having to cancel her speaking dates. And I just felt that, like, how I was always a very high achieving student, but I will always remember like this final that I screwed up the date on in college, and I missed my final. And now I'm like, oh, ADHD explains a lot of this. But I was like, I ended up being fine. I got an incomplete for the semester. My professor let me take the exam the following semester, and then it was okay. But like, I was just like in agony over it because I felt like so much shame for like, how did I miss my final? How did I screw that up? So I just like related to that. I feel like I felt that in many levels, but that one like experience from college really comes back. The feeling of it still comes back. And that's really kind of what leads into talking a lot about shame and then empathy. So she says there's the shame 1, 2, 3s. This is basically intro to shame. A is we all have it. Shame is universal, and it's one of the most primitive human emotions. 2, we're all afraid to talk about shame, which is so true. And 3, the less we talk about shame, the more control it has over our lives. And it really drives these like 2 different tracks inside of our minds. One is you're not good enough. And the other is like, who do you think you are? Like, you're getting too big for your britches, she says, like in her like Texas, in her Texas way.
Don't get too big for your britches.
Yeah. And neuroscience shows that the pain and feelings of rejection that shame inflicts are as real as physical pain.
The body keeps the score.
Yep. Like our body, we try to ignore our bodies, but our bodies take it all in, right? And then she spent some time separating, which I actually found really helpful as somebody who I feel like has not had the highest emotional literacy. It's gotten a lot better in recent years, but emotional literacy is basically being able to name your feelings, right? So she talks about like shame versus guilt. So guilt is I did something bad. Shame is I am bad. So shame in itself is not a compass for moral behavior. it's more about like self-worth, right? Versus guilt can sometimes indicate that like you did something bad, right? I mean, it can also be misplaced guilt, but that's like generally the differentiator. And she talks about like where like shame is highly correlated with addiction, violence, aggression, depression, eating disorders, and bullying, while guilt is actually negatively correlated with them because it indicates that we're in touch with our empathy. Like if we can feel guilt, then we feel like the impact that we have on somebody else, which is interesting.
So there's 8 cardinal virtues in Chinese. There's brotherly love, there's filial piety, integrity. One of them is knowing shame. And I think it's mistranslated because it should be, and there's a saying, knowing shame is close to courage. But I think, again, like translating things into English, the shame is I am bad. I don't think that's the right translation. It's like you should recognize your wrongdoing and its effect on other people. And if you do that, you will almost automatically, if you're working from your conscience, start to take action to correct your behavior.
Right.
But the idea that I am bad, I will always be bad, and there's nothing I can do to change it, is not a productive, healthy, corrective feeling. It's fine to feel guilty. We make mistakes. Okay, you made a mistake. Feel guilty. I know that. I feel courage to correct. Okay, I know I can fix this. That's healthy. But feeling like I can never fix this or I'm just flawed, inherently flawed, where does that come from? Religion? I don't know. Fear-mongering? Like, those are really powerful, culturally shaping devices, if you will, that are used intentionally.
For sure. And then humiliation is people feel like they deserve their shame, but they don't believe they deserve their humiliation. So humiliation is actually like less destructive because this is like happening from somebody else or something else to you, right? So you can start buying into your humiliation and it can turn into shame, but humiliation in itself is less destructive because people don't necessarily feel like they deserve to be humiliated, but they do feel like they deserve their shame because that is like ultimately the core of their self-worth, right? And then embarrassment is normally fleeting and can usually eventually be funny is the way to think about it. So I found that helpful to like differentiate shame from all these other feelings.
Let's define these feelings.
Yeah.
And she talks about emotional literacy should be able to name 30 emotions that you feel. I'm like, I can do 3. You know,
we actually do this in the education part of the GENUS emotional intelligence assessment, which we'll talk all about in a couple episodes. Actually, I think the episode after this, but yeah, one of the things is like name all the feelings you felt in the last 24 hours. It's very difficult.
I want to cuss. My brain just exploded a little bit.
Yeah, you know, yep. But
is abject fear an emotion? Frustrating.
Well, fear is an emotion.
Can we add abject to it? Danger. If I'm thinking of A Few Good Men, and he's like, danger, grave danger. Do you know any other kind? No, you know, it's great. Okay, all right, let's move on.
And then like cues that shame has permeated our culture, because shame can also permeate into an organizational culture, which I found really interesting as a concept. So looking out for perfectionism, favoritism, gossiping, comparison, self-worth being tied to productivity. Oh my God. Harassment, discrimination, power over.
Okay, hold on though. Let's go back to self-worth being part of, productivity. Your value in the market is absolutely tied to your ability to produce.
But that's different from your self-worth.
That's different from your self-worth.
Yes. Yeah. And there are definitely company cultures. I have worked in them that definitely feed. I mean, I think you also have to have some of those feelings within yourself. But if you tend to feel that way where your self-worth is tied to your identity and then you work for a culture that promotes that, then I can say from experience, it is not a good combo, to say the least. But yeah, power over versus we were talking about on the last episode, the difference between power over and power with power to power within. And the others are bullying, blaming, teasing, cover-ups. So those are all indicators that shame may have permeated your company or team culture. She also talks a little bit about firing people, which we really should do an episode on. And I actually think it'd be really interesting to do with you, Mike, because having spent so much time in hospitality management, you've fired a lot of people, unfortunately.
I cannot comment or confirm nor deny.
So I would love to I have not, because I've mostly worked for bigger companies where it's a whole process to let somebody go, right?
I've had a lot of conversations. I really like this too. She talks about when firing people, aim to give them a way out with dignity. Can they resign? You're bound by the HR laws of your particular state. I like this because I try and do this when I'm giving feedback too, mostly probably because I don't like to feel uncomfortable. I'm probably zigzagging, but I do find people generally have a pretty good internal compass of behavior and morality and success. And if you present them with some kind of facts and situation and ask them, do you feel this was the right? Most people will own up to it and start to self-correct without you having to berate them or bully them or shame them or none of those behaviors are particularly healthy for long-term growth and improvement on your team.
Yeah, I really like this. Give people a way out with dignity and make that your objective, meeting all of the requirements of HR laws and such. But I liked that as well. And she kind of gets into what is shame resilience, because that is a thing. We don't just have to feel shame and bury it deep down and never speak of it, shockingly. So shame resilience is the ability to practice authenticity when we experience shame, to move through the experience without sacrificing our values, and come out on the other side of the experience with more courage, compassion, and connection than we had going into it.
Well, and self-empathy too. I think you can empathize with yourself.
Yes.
If you step back from the experiences that you're experiencing, and
self-compassion.
Some self-compassion. I guess that's probably what empathy for yourself is.
Yeah. Well, but that gets into, she says, empathy is the antidote to shame. And that's not the same as comparative suffering. So comparative suffering is when someone invalidates your feelings by comparing the situation to something worse. It's my mom just died. Well, look on the bright side. At least your dad's still alive and healthy. Or things oh, wow, that's nothing. When I lost both my parents in the same, when people try to
one-upsmanship.
One up you. Yeah. So comparative suffering is not empathy. Actual empathy is infinite and renewable. And when you think of it that way, there's not an either or, right? It's not situation is definitively worse than the other. It doesn't matter, because we don't run out of empathy if we're in touch with it. So you can still have empathy for somebody without being well, at least you have a roof over your head.
Compassion fatigue is a thing, though.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
But that comes down to boundaries, right?
Yeah. What are those?
But I like that she says empathy is not about connecting to an experience, the actual situation. It's connecting to the emotions that underpin an experience. Hey there. You know how easy it is to get caught up in the day-to-day grind of leadership? Putting out fires, dealing with endless emails, back-to-back meetings. Before you know it, you've lost sight of the bigger picture. If you're feeling overwhelmed or disconnected from your leadership purpose, I've got something for you. And it's completely free. It's a 5-day leadership reset challenge I've put together. Each day you'll spend just 10 to 15 minutes on a quick exercise. We'll help you get clear on your vision again, boost your confidence, improve how you communicate, and more. If this sounds like something you could use, check out the show notes, or you can go directly to llpod.link/challenge to get your free challenge guide. I think you'll get a lot out of it. Now back to the show.
Yeah, I thought this section was awesome. Like I said, she really is able to talk about these, what are somewhat esoteric concepts, feelings, emotions, vulnerable, and spell them out in such solid, concrete terms that are very approachable, understandable, teachable, and repeatable. You know, I was thinking earlier, this has to now be part of my little lexicon of Leadership 101. And I don't know if it's bumping one of the other books off the trio or being added to it, but I think with the work here is so deep on the human level, on yourself and how you connect to others.
It's so important.
It's so important.
And these are skills that are like, I mean, this is addressed towards leadership, but oh my God, these skills are useful for everything. And so she gets into 5 key skills of empathy and then 6 barriers to empathy. I thought all of these were amazing. As you can probably imagine, like I didn't really cut much out of my notes for this book. This is part of why we're doing this in 2 parts, because it's just so much of it is so valuable.
Well, you were just impressed with my notes for extreme ownership. How U.S. Navy SEALs lead and win.
Oh my God. So 5 key skills of empathy. Number 1 is perspective taking, which is to see the world as others see it.
Or try to, at least.
And try to. Yeah. So like a lot of this is like honoring people's perspectives as truth, even when they're different from ours. And I was like, oh my God, the timing of this in election season. But like honoring that, like for the other person, their perspective is truth and not trying to invalidate that. I think this, when we talk about the levels of listening, immersive listening is such a powerful tool for this, because you need to be able to come at it from a place of curiosity and kind of turn off your own emotional activation and how it like might relate back to your own point of view. She says perspective taking requires being the learner, not the knower. So you have to really take a different mindset for it. And then number 2 is to be non-judgmental. She says, generally, we judge in areas where we're most susceptible to shame, and we judge people who are doing worse than we are in those areas.
So when I judge the terrible drivers, I'm ashamed of my drive. I don't know. I'm a good driver.
I don't know. What does that say? I don't know that it's that literal, but it's interesting.
Well, I'm not patient with myself, so I'm definitely not patient with other people.
Yeah, well, there you go.
You can turn right, sir, without coming to a complete stop, I promise.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because she repeats that later in the book, and she says this is why parenting is such a source of judgment, because like all parents just feel so much guilt and feel like they're like screwing up their kids, right? Because it's just part of the experience of being a parent. And that's why there's so much parents judging each other, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, that's a really fundamental, primal part of us too.
Oh, yeah.
And when she talks about this, when she says primitive, she's talking about like parts of the brain that developed earlier than other parts of the brain. Not in you, but in our species.
Yeah, this is like our reptile brain.
Yeah.
Stuff that we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I thought this was also just a good point, is take note, like where are the areas where you're really judgmental? And like that might be a signal of a cycle of shame forming. It's like, interesting. Oh, Mike just went in and highlighted that.
I'm just enjoying that we're working off a shared document.
So the next 2 are related. So it's number 3, to understand another person's feelings. And then number 4, to communicate your understanding of that person's feelings. So,
what I'm hearing is...
Exactly. Paraphrasing and clarification questions and all that. Oh.
See, shared document.
Oh. And now he just wrote, I love you. It's very cute.
Oh, it's embarrassing. Don't share that. It's
Why
private. It's our shared document.
That we're using as a basis for talking to the world.
Fine. Don't share our family Slack, though. That's between us.
No, would never. Yeah.
Fair. So what we Slack in the family stays in the family. Oh, God.
Oh, my God.
Oh, my God.
So, yes, to understand another person's feelings and communicate that understanding requires us to first be in touch with our own feelings and also be at least somewhat fluent in the language of feelings. So that's emotional literacy. Right?
She added 3 and 4 together too, because they're the same stuff.
They're related. Yeah. It comes back to emotional literacy, which is needed to process our emotions. And it's also a prerequisite for empathy, shame, resilience, and the ability to reset and rise after a fall. And I like this concept of emotional literacy. I will start using that a lot. I think we talked about this a lot with Megan in the last episode.
I need a list of emotions that I can point to, like I'm a 4-year-old. How are you feeling?
The feelings wheels are a thing.
Google's feelings wheels.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
She also talks about the iceberg effect, which I mentioned in our last episode because I love the iceberg effect for so many things. But if you imagine people's feelings as an iceberg, like what is on the surface, which might be like anger, for example, can be very different from what's below the surface, like at the bottom of the iceberg. And she said often shame and grief are really hard to express for most people. So we often turn to anger or silence. And that's what's on the surface that other people were reading. And then the fifth one is mindfulness, which is all about taking a balanced approach to negative feelings, that feelings are neither suppressed nor exaggerated. And I love this so much. I've talked about mindfulness and it relates a lot to the improv-based work I do as well. But I also went on a 10-day Vipassana meditation silent retreat a few years ago, and I actually signed up to go on another one in January of this year.
Bye. See you.
Bye. Which is crazy. And maybe in another episode, I'll talk more about that experience and kind of things I learned from it.
Like that you were in love with me.
Yeah, maybe.
Because you couldn't stop thinking about me?
Yeah. This is like a few weeks after Mike and I met. Aw. But
you also said you knew I was different than the rest of your friends when I was like, oh, cool. That sounds great. And everybody else was like, why would you want to do that? I was like, I want to do that.
You're like, oh, I totally get it. It was funny. But the Vipassana as a type of meditation, it's essentially a body scan, but it's all about you're experiencing every single feeling and sensation in your body, like each part at a time, but you're also really practicing non-judgment. So labeling that feeling as neutral, which is really hard, like when you're feeling pain, which, oh my God, if you're sitting to meditate for 10 hours a day and you're not used to it, it is so physically painful. Nobody tells you that. But a lot of what you're doing is learning to recognize feelings as neutral instead of labeling them as bad or good. And it's so hard, but it's so good for this stuff. And then the 6 barriers to empathy. So number one, that's where she talks about sympathy versus empathy, which we kind of like foreshadowed in the last episode. But the difference here is empathy is feeling with people. So like, I get it. I feel with you. I've been there.
I've been there. You have to have been there to feel some.
Yeah, but it's a line between I've been there is not like, let me make this all about me now, and more like, I feel you.
Yeah. I can identify with the feeling.
I can identify with you. I feel you. Like I'm feeling with you right now.
Yeah.
Versus sympathy is feeling for them. So I feel sorry for you.
Her story of trying to make it home for her daughter's lacrosse game. And it was amazing. And she's having a full-on meltdown in the airport because her flight's getting canceled and her teammate or assistant, I'm not sure, is desperately trying to rebook flights and everything. And finally, she looks at Brené and she goes, we're not going to make it.
Yeah.
Clear as kind. And Brené just keeps, apparently, like when she's overwhelmed, she just keeps saying, I don't understand. And her friend is like, we're not going to make it. This sucks. My heart's breaking for you too. My heart's not breaking for you, but my heart's breaking now also. Not like, oh, you poor thing. Bless your heart, as they say in Texas.
Yeah.
Brené talks about later, like, it's good that she didn't try and hug me because I might have smacked her. Not really, but that people need different things when they're in these emotional states. But our friend knew exactly what to do, which is just stay with be comfortable in the space. We shy away from our own feelings, so we like to shy away from other people's feelings. And she didn't do that. She stuck through it with the discomfort of Brené's breakdown. And she didn't care that she was having a meltdown in public. She's like, you go ahead, have a meltdown, enjoy. Yeah, and that I think that experience probably brought the two of them very much even more close together. And she probably appreciates that years and years later.
Yeah. And she notes that like empathy is not climbing into the hole of the emotions with the other person.
Yeah.
That is called enmeshment, which is a different thing. So you're still keeping your boundaries, but you're feeling with them. So you're not taking on all of their emotions and you're not like making it your problem, but you're feeling with them. And I think that's important. And she says like the two most powerful words when somebody is struggling are me too. And basically what you're saying, even if you don't use those exact words, because it depends on what you're talking about, right? But basically it's like, I may not have had the exact same experience as you, but I know this struggle and you are not alone. And that you are not alone in this, I feel with you, is the most important part of that.
Well, yeah, I've kind of gone over this. I'm definitely I feel like I'm a pretty empathetic person, but maybe I'm a sympathetic person, and I'm still exploring the difference between those two. And I think one of the main differences, like in sympathy, it's armored. You don't expose your own feelings. You're like, oh, I feel sorry for you. And you're not sharing that you too have felt the exact same way. And you've also been hurt, and you know how painful that hurt is. It's almost like I'm up here and you're down here. Oh, it's too bad for you, but I'm fine. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that one's a little longer, but the other 5 of these, I felt this so much. Like when we were talking about barriers to empathy. I lost my dad when I was 35. I was on the younger end. So I had like 1 or 2 friends who'd lost parents, but not very many. And it is so interesting when you go through something like that. For one thing, you really find out who your real friends are, but you also just kind of realize how many people have no idea what to say.
But she says that's okay. And it's all right to be like, this sucks. I don't even know what to say right now.
Like it's way better.
That's way better.
But I feel like the other ones of these are kind of things that people say when they like don't know how to deal with it, right? So the gasp and awe, which is terrible, which is like you share your story and then somebody feels shame on your behalf and they're like appalled. So they're like, oh God, I would just die if that happened to me, kind of thing. And then suddenly it's like, I mean, personally, I'm very like off put by that, but like, or you feel like it's now you need to make them feel better. Like it's not that bad. It's not a good reaction. Or the mighty fall, this is particularly when you like make a mistake or something. Like the other person needs to think of you as this pillar of worthiness and authenticity. Mm-hmm. And they are so let down by your imperfections that they can't help you. So you're like, I just never expected that from you.
Yeah. Like, she has that where an audience member was like, you're my authenticity role model. I'm so disappointed that I don't know if she cussed or something. And Brené was like, I should not be your role model. I'm on this journey with you. I'm on my own journey. Yeah. But we're all human. We're all human.
Yep. And then the block and tackle, which is like the other person is so uncomfortable with the vulnerability that they scold you. So it's like, what were you thinking?
Jeez.
Yeah. The boots and shovels. So the other person like desperately feels like they need to make it better so that they can get out of their own discomfort. So
looks around uncomfortably.
So they like refuse to acknowledge that you can actually make mistakes or just like really bad things can happen, right? It's like, oh, it can't be that bad. You're amazing. Or I think this is what a lot of people come from when somebody dies, where it's like, well, at least he's in a better place now. I'm like, that's the kind of thing you say when like you're trying
to get out of it.
Yeah, you're trying to just get out of the discomfort, but like it's actually don't say that to somebody when a loved one dies, just as a general. I actually have wanted to make a guide to people and like when a close friend of yours loses somebody close to them, here's what not to say or what to say, right? And then the last one is if you think that's bad.
That was perfect time to one up somebody. That's a great time.
Just like the person confuses connection with the opportunity to one up. And this is interesting to me because I've actually heard that it's a thing with ADHD or like I think maybe other types of neurodivergence where a way to connect with people is by sharing similar
shared
stories.
Suffering. Sure.
Right.
You're not actually trying to one up.
Yeah.
You're trying to articulate a feeling that you might not express feelings well, or you express them intellectually.
And you can share an experience and do so in a way that is like all about doing so with empathy, right? It's like that I'm with you. Like I may not know exactly what you're feeling, but I can really feel for you on this. That's very different from this, which is oh yeah, me too. Listen to this. So the main difference is that it shifts the focus to the other person. And I think that's really important to remember, right? Like when you're sharing your story from a place of empathy, you're sharing it as a way to show the other person that they're not alone.
Yeah.
Versus when you're sharing it from this place, it's about making it about you. And I love it so much. She also just gets into the idea like empathy is a skill. We'll screw it up, but you can continue to improve it over time.
She has a phrase that she uses a lot in the book, which is like, circle back and clean it up. That's a very Texan like phrase. We can clean it up. And so you can make a mess in a relationship, in a connection, and like, okay, you were out of your integrity there. You need to go clean it up. That's more, I think, descriptive and paint done, right? Clean it up is more descriptive and complete than apologize. Clean it up has a more kind of broad idea of like, we need to reconnect. We need to like explore how it happened. We need to get to the root of the problem. Maybe we'll rumble with vulnerability and we'll clean it up.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yep. And the rest of this section gets into, so that was like, how can you empathize with other people? And the rest of this is kind of about how can you empathize with yourself? So like a lot of this is self-kindness. This is the talk to yourself the way you would talk to somebody you love.
Nope. Not gonna do it.
Self-kindness is self-empathy, basically. And she also has word choices. I think these are actually really good for like when you're not sure what to say to somebody else, and also as things to say to yourself when you're trying to talk to yourself and have empathy for yourself, is like oh man, I feel you. I know that feeling and it sucks. I see you. You're not alone. I've been in a similar place and it's really hard. I think a lot of us experience that. Either we're all normal or we're all weird, but either way, it's not just you. And I understand what that's like. Like, these are really good phrases. I really do want to make a guide for people of like things to say and not say.
Yeah.
When somebody dies or goes through a really hard time, right? Because we don't know if we're not taught what to say.
When people with complicated relationships with loved ones can experience different things, like the loved one who maybe caused a lot of their trauma passes away and they have very conflicted feelings about it. And some of their feelings are relief centered. And of course they feel guilty about that because you're not supposed to, and you're like, oh, you poor thing. And you're like, actually, I'm a little bit happy. And now you're in some weird shame storm. So it is not a one size fits all.
Yeah. Yeah. And then to kind of wrap this up, I'm realizing this is a very meaty section.
Much meat.
We spent a lot of time
Very
on
deep.
it, but it's so good.
It's so good.
So the 4 elements of shame resilience. So this is like the bouncing back from like knowing how to acknowledge when you feel shame and move forward. So number 1, recognizing shame and understanding its triggers, and understanding our physiology when we're feeling shame, like paying attention to what is happening in your body. And she notes that we have these shame shields that we use to avoid feeling shame. So there's moving away, moving toward, moving against. So moving away is like withdrawing, hiding, silencing ourselves. I would never do that. That's not my way of handling this at all.
Avoidant.
Or moving toward, seeking to appease and please.
Yeah, when I see this too, I think these can be physical too.
They can be.
You can really watch people's body language and see the way they're positioned, see, are they crossing it's not body language is not as simple as it's made to seem on TV. We should do that book. I got to find that.
There's body language book?
Yeah, it's another like FBI dude.
Yeah.
And they really break down like, okay, just looking up and to the left doesn't indicate lying. You need baselines of people's body language.
Yeah.
It's more complicated than that.
It's more complicated.
But you can see there's a physical reaction to emotions, to feelings. And by practicing mindfulness, you can learn a lot if you're paying attention.
Well, and then like the moving against is trying to gain power over others and using shame to fight shame. So like these are all clues that you or somebody else might like really just be feeling shame, and we just do everything we can to avoid feeling it. Which is crazy. It's so true. So number 2, practicing critical awareness. She says shame is like a zoom lens. So when we're feeling shame, we're just so zoomed in on ourselves that like all we see is our flawed self. We feel really alone. So zooming out helps us see that we're a part of something, and anything you can do to realize you're not alone in this, whether it's finding like a Facebook support group or whatever it is you're going through, like having conversations with people, like reminding yourself that you're not alone helps take you out of that shame spiral. Reaching out, this is similar, like helping us learn the experiences that make us feel alone are actually the most universal. And then speaking shame, because shame derives its power from being unspeakable. And this is very powerful. So that was a lot.
What's the quote? Like, speak the truth, even if your voice shakes.
Ooh, I like that. I like that a lot.
Yeah.
Nice.
That's courage.
Well, then moving into section 5, and we're like almost done with part 1. Luckily, the other 3 parts were much shorter. So otherwise, this would be like a multi-part episode.
Listen, Jocko has done like multiple 3-hour podcasts on certain books. I think, and I love this book on the psychology of military incompetence. Took them like 9 hours to get through.
I'll tell you what, baby. When we have 3 million followers or whatever it is, we can do some much longer episodes. But
it's such a good book too.
I can't imagine to listening to anybody, including you, for 9 hours.
Jeez.
I love you.
No, that's fair.
I mean, you're like also like...
Also, yes.
It's a long time.
It's a long time.
So section 5 is all about curiosity and grounded confidence. And she defines grounded confidence as the messy process of learning and unlearning, practicing and failing, and surviving a few misses, which is not the same thing as like blustery arrogance or being built on BS. It's like this real solid and built on self-awareness and practice.
That's what I was thinking of with jiu-jitsu. They did a study where like lobsters, if they lose a fight, they're far more likely to lose the next fight. And if they win a fight with another, they're far more likely to win it. And I observed that on the mats. If you do well in a role, you feel confident in your skills. And if you don't, which is more the norm, you're getting tossed around, it is very hard to believe that what you know will work, which is absolutely the prerequisite for it working. But when you do it enough, you start to gain that grounded confidence and awareness of what you're good at, what you're not good at, what you need to work on, and the ability to dissect a situation and see like, where did I go wrong or what's not firing?
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's interesting. She talks about how when leaders don't have the skills to lean into vulnerability, they're not successfully able to navigate paradoxes that I think also line up with the dichotomy of leadership that you've talked about with Jocko, right? It's like the letting chaos reign versus reigning in chaos, like big heart versus tough decision making, humility versus fierce resolve, thinking global versus acting local, ambition versus attention to detail, thinking big versus starting small. So she argues that leaders need the skills to lean into vulnerability in order to actually navigate those.
And uncertainty. I remember the book. It's by a general from the National Guard, I think from Pennsylvania. It was a great book. And he talks about leaders really need to make decisions when they have between 50 and 70% of the information that you would like to have to make the decision. Mm-hmm. And that is not, I mean, that's a learned skill for some people. I'm a very analytical person, and that can be hard to make a decision with incomplete data. Even though I'm also kind of known as an impulsive person, I'm collecting data to make decisions. And that's part of the chaos of situations and, life, I guess.
Yeah, right.
I guess. Yeah. How do you walk that fine line in between these, she says, paradoxes, Jocko says dichotomies? They're competing priorities. As we saw in that book, you have to be close to your team, but not too close. You have to show emotion, but not too emotional. All of those things. So it's balance, right? The center.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it was also interesting. One of the things she's also talked about in this section is that many organizations have actually gone too far in making learning too easy. And like research actually shows that in order for learning to be effective, it needs to be effortful.
Yeah, I wrote that down too. The brain needs a certain level of discomfort for learning. Curiosity is actually a skill of vulnerability. It's also a skill that requires the comfort in chaos. in jiu-jitsu, we drill moves, and you'll drill them 5, 10, 15, 20, 100 times. But then when you're actually rolling, the experience doesn't look like that at all. It's 200% more chaotic. And being comfortable in that scramble, and then even being willing to create the scramble and to know how to take advantage of the scramble, that is far more useful of a skill than knowing the rote steps or the technical, like back to Game of Thrones, like chaos is a ladder. So it is, if you know how to climb it, I guess.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I'm not good at any. I'm not good at any of that. I like order. I like regularity. If you go in my closet, my shirts are lined up in order. There's white, then there's stripes, then there's blue.
He also doesn't have that many shirts.
I have a lot of shirts, but they're all the same.
They're all the same shirt.
Yeah, I have 11 of the same blue shirt.
Yep, it's true.
Yeah.
No.
So.
But yeah, and then she defines grounded confidence is rumble skills plus curiosity plus practice.
Sure.
Which, yeah.
Yeah.
And curiosity is an act of vulnerability and courage.
Yeah.
And it's correlated with creativity, intelligence, improved learning, and memory and problem solving, which definitely goes in line with my work and what I've seen as well, for sure. And she says that the most common barrier to getting curious is having a dry well, because it's harder to be curious about something that you have no knowledge or awareness of. So you might have to prime the pump by using intriguing information to get people interested first. But I also think so much of this is a mindset, right? If you go into any situation prepared to be curious, it makes it so much easier.
I think that's such a good concept overall.
Yeah.
The curiosity.
Yeah, for sure.
Where are you coming from with this? How did you get to this point? And then trying to trace those threads in people as far back as you possibly can. You'll understand their perspective, their motivations, their fears, their hopes, their, all of that stuff. You'll get a very vivid picture.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we just had some friends over, and I was chatting with them about what made dating easier for me was to just go in with a mindset of I can talk to anybody for 30 minutes. And if I just go in interested in hearing their story and learning something, it takes the pressure off and it makes it so much easier versus all the negativity that comes with something like
Were
dating.
you prepared to bounce after 30 minutes?
Oh, absolutely.
Wow.
But I didn't
I'm not
with
like
you.
That. I'm not like that. I had a friend one time, I was trying to put on the whole show. So I would be 3 or 5 hour dates or something.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And I thought I'm trying to and my friend was like, no, dude, you're giving them an epic movie. Give them an episode of a season and make them want to come back for more. I was like, oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's a lot of time to spend with somebody that you're just, yeah.
I'm very intense in that. I was like, this is not.
I mean, granted, I think our first date was several hours.
Yeah, but it seemed natural. And I did not plan that.
We could have ended it early if we weren't feeling it.
I was just going to throw you a croissant and be on my way. Have a coffee and a croissant.
Yeah. Well, things worked out okay, I guess. So believe it or not, I think we have actually wrapped up part 1 of 4.
The other 3 are pretty quick.
Yes, the other 3 are much quicker.
Yeah.
So, I do emphasize this is the majority of the book.
It's the crux of it. And
it's really the deepest.
It's the deepest. And I do feel like a lot of times people who write books, and I don't know, I'll probably never write one, but they add on maybe an extra third of stuff that they feel they need to make the book longer. There's a lot of good stuff in here, though.
There is. Yeah, and then part 2 is all about values. And she's defining value, which I think is a very kind of universal definition, is a way of being or believing that we hold most important. So our values are basically what we consider to be most important to us. It's just how you define it. And living into our values is more than just professing our values. Saying your values is one thing. we're actually being clear about what they are, and we're taking care that our intentions, our words, our thoughts, and our behaviors actually align with those beliefs. And then she actually goes into a process to identify your values. I think one really important thing, there's only, I think, one mention that I saw in the book, but there's actually a lot of resources that go with this. If you go to her website and then Dare to Lead, we can include a link to it in the show notes. But she has all these free resources. She doesn't even collect an email, which, like, to be clear, if I enjoy a book, I have absolutely no problem giving somebody my email to get their free resources.
She's probably like, stop giving me.
But yeah, she doesn't even care.
Yeah,
she has 6 #1 New York Times bestsellers, I guess.
No more emails, please. Stop emailing me about giving me your email.
But yeah, you can just go on her website and you can download, and there's like a 40-page workbook that goes with this, and it actually has like exercises that go through all this stuff. And there's also like a list of values, like value words, that is in the book and on her free resources. And I would say in general, if you have never been through the process of identifying your values, do it. I think it's really important to understand what those are.
Yeah, getting clear about, I mean, people who have gone through some seasons of life will have whittled away to see what they're made of and what's most important. But actually doing the exercise and really having to clarify what is most important to you is pretty useful.
Yeah. And she says, we only have one set of values. We don't shift them based on context. Now, I would argue that I think these at heart or overall are going to stay pretty consistent throughout your life. Like, I do think I have some values that have things that are still important, like travel and adventure. Like, these are still things I value, but are they as high up on my list of values as they were 5 or 10 years ago? Like, probably not. So I do think some of these maybe shift a little bit throughout your life, but it is generally something that, like, it's not going to vary by context, right?
Well, she says there's not home values and work values.
Yeah, like whether if you're home at work, like these are still going to be your values. And what's interesting about this, like most people are probably going to circle like 10 to 15 values when they go through this list of words and maybe add their own. But she really insists that it's important to pick the 2 that you hold most dear, which is really hard. But she says that her research showed that participants that had the most willingness to practice vulnerability and courage tethered their behavior to 1 or 2 values, not 10. So I thought this was interesting. I've done a lot of values exercises in the past. I know Mike has too, but I was curious. I'm like, okay, if we had to narrow them down to 2, what would they be? So we both did this exercise and we have not shared them with each other.
Oh,
yet.
I don't agree with this. I'm sorry.
I know you don't, but we'll talk about it.
There's some part of this I agree with, but there's some part I don't.
I know. Well, we'll talk about that in the what didn't resonate. But if you had to choose from 2 values, if you had to narrow it down to 2 values, what would they be?
So I am more on board with 1.
Interesting.
And then I am with 2. And I think I'm going to go to the 5 constant virtues that Confucius elucidates, which are benevolence, propriety, wisdom, righteousness, and faith or trustworthiness. So those are my 5 values.
Okay, but
if I have to choose one, it's benevolence.
Benevolence.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which in the Buddhists, they talk about compassion. I don't think it's exactly the same thing. I think compassion is a little closer to kindness. Mm-hmm. Benevolence is, oh God, I don't dare try and explain it. But I will tell you that the Chinese character for benevolence is made up of the characters for man or human and the character for 2. So in order to have benevolence, you need 2 people.
And what would your second be?
Of the 5, I would say faith.
Interesting. Okay.
There's a saying, Confucius is saying, without faith, you cannot be established.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So I like what she's doing. It's whittled down who you are and what's important to you to 1 or 2 things that you can remember and keep in your working memory. If we go back to boundaries, right? Boundaries for leaders. There's what are we paying attention to? What are we not allowing? And what can we keep in working memory? I think you can only keep so many things in working memory. I think you could keep more than one or two, but getting it down to some very key concepts will inform your choices and decisions in everything you do. And hers was courage, and I think also faith.
Yes.
And so whenever she's faced with the situation, she can go back to that. And if I'm going to act courageously in this situation, how will I act? And then do that. And that's good kung fu, man. I like the concept. I don't agree 100% with her approach, but it's good stuff.
The two I came up with were, one was compassion, but I was like going a little back and forth. Like benevolence might almost be a better word for it, because ultimately a lot of it's like the caring about people and helping them and empowering them, right? It's like a very deep value of mine. And then my other one was growth, like the being always open to learning and growing and improving, which I know is also a very high value of yours.
Yeah, if you want to go constant virtues, you can go wisdom, which is like a growth and a natural restoration of our bright nature. And I think it's sometimes when people say compassion, I think it's like sympathy almost. And that's the only thing. And it's also associated with suffering. So it's not necessarily always suffering, right? Like sometimes it's just like helping people figure out what the next step in their path is. And they don't necessarily need to be like suffering to benefit from help with that and support. So that's how I get to benevolence. If I have to pick one, but like helping other people grow, I feel like that's benevolence. My mentorship, coaching approach to leadership, I think that's, it's a much more cosmic kindness, if you will. And that can also entail the very difficult conversations. It doesn't mean being nice. If you really have benevolence for somebody, you will not let them sit there with their shortcomings or their areas of opportunity. You will help them face it and move forward. That's real kindness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's not kindness to be like, oh, it'll be okay. You're fine. No, actually, there's some work to be done. And I feel you. I've been there. Here's some steps you can take, or let's workshop this or something, but not to just ignore.
Yeah.
That's not kindness at all.
Yeah. And she says our values should be so crystallized in our minds that they don't feel like a choice.
It's not a choice.
They're simply a definition of who we are in our lives. Yeah. And in the hard moments, we know we'll pick what's right over what's fun, fast, or easy.
Yeah.
But then she gets, which is something I feel so hard, which is that only 10% of organizations have actually operationalized their values into teachable and observable behaviors that are actually used to train their employees and hold them accountable.
So in Good to Great, they found that it didn't actually matter what your organizational values were. As long as you had them and were able to put them into practice, those companies were going to be far more successful. But what they were didn't matter.
I believe that, honestly. I mean, I'm sure there's some limits of that, right?
Well, sure.
But
we're not doing Gordon.
To some degree, as long as to some degree, your organization values being ethical. Otherwise, that's going to come out eventually, right? But I agree that what the values are is less important as actually identifying what behaviors are associated with those values and then incentivizing that behavior across the organization, starting with the top and modeling it from the top. Like I have been a part of so many times where like the leadership team meets and they're like, these are our company values. And now we're putting it on the wall all throughout the office. So now these are our values now, right? Like that is not actually instilling your values into the organization. It takes a lot more than that. And actually identifying it with specific behaviors and holding people accountable for them is so important. And this is kind of what she gets into from here is actually whether we're talking personal values or organizational values, identifying like what are the behaviors that support our values and then what are our slippery behaviors that are like actions that we find ourselves tempted to do even if they don't actually meet our values, and being honest with yourself about that. And we talked about this a little bit earlier in this series, but daring leaders who live into their values are never silent about the hard things. Because if you can opt out of those conversations, the conversations about privilege and oppression, because they make you uncomfortable, that is the epitome of privilege.
Yeah, I hear that.
I feel that so hard. And I feel like this is a big area that I personally want to keep developing for myself, is like, how do we have those hard conversations and show up and like also accept that like I'm going to say some things that are wrong.
Yep.
And that's better than not saying anything at all, as long as I'm learning from it. And yeah, it's hard, but it's harder to be on the other side of it. So she also gives 10 points to make sure you're in the right headspace to give somebody feedback. I'm not going to read these out right now because we just did a whole episode not long ago on how to give feedback and how to put yourself in the right mindset. But I did want to call it out for anybody who's reading the book. And she also like talks about how important it is to have that team conversation, because you have your organizational values, right? And you have your personal values, but you can also have team values that ideally are pulling in some of those organizational values, but customizing them for your team, right? For example, you have like a data analyst team. You're probably going to have some specific values that relate to that within a broader company that has their own values, right?
I remember I did this. I remember when I read this book the first time now, it was when I was at the hotel. And we did this as a team. And I'm like, let's pick 5 things about how we're going to operate together. And I remember one of the things we picked was like very direct communication, because we were all struggling in our departments and we were standing in each other's way. So one of our values was going to be very clear communication about how we're working together in a polite way, but we're going to be very direct about where we're falling short. And I think it helped. And every time we would come together in a meeting, it's okay, how are we doing on this value? You know, let's filter out the noise and run it through the sieve of what we've agreed that we will work together in this manner.
Yeah, I love that. She also encourages everyone to identify like, how do your values relate to receiving feedback? And what is a value supporting behavior or piece of self-talk that you can use to help yourself when you're receiving feedback, especially if it's something that might emotionally activate you, might put you on the defense, right? So like hers are like, I'm brave enough to listen, or there's something valuable here. Take what works and leave the rest. So ahead of time, identifying like, what are those beliefs or mantras that you can use going into those conversations. So from this moves into part 3. See, we told you that the other parts were shorter. We're moving faster.
Are we?
No, we're getting there, guys. We really are. So the part 3 is braving trust. And she uses a definition of trust from Charles Feltman and The Thin Book of Trust. His definition of trust is choosing to risk making something you value vulnerable to another person's actions.
Like saying, I love you first.
Oh, I thought we just skipped over this story.
I will never forget this. I will never forget this. That's she somewhere in the book, she says, the ultimate like act of vulnerability is being the first person to say, I love you in a relationship.
Mike insists that when he first told me he loved me, that there was an extremely long pause.
It was so long.
I mean, it wasn't that long.
It felt like...
I was surprised.
And I'm just looking at you going, oh no. As your face, like I couldn't read your face. And I was like...
Well, it was also dark.
It wasn't that dark. It wasn't that dark. And I was just like, oh, okay. All right. I'm just going to go hide my face in shame. And I think that is the correct usage of the definition of shame. I was like,
but then I told you I loved you too.
I don't remember that part.
Yes, you do.
Kind of.
Lies.
But it is. It's, you know.
But yes, that is truly vulnerable.
Lots of vulnerability that we experience. The more we lean into it, the more fully we will live. I guess the more like highs we will have in our life.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's like, I guess why people go skydiving and base jumping and things like that. The vulnerability is what makes it exciting. Yeah.
I guess so. I have not
No, me neither.
had the desire for skydiving.
Saying I love you first was as vulnerable as I wanted.
That was as much risk.
Yeah, that's a
as you.
lot of risk. Jumping off the babe. No, thank you.
I also, the main thing I love about this part is she gives this like 7-step inventory for the behaviors that define trust. And it stands for braving. I mean, I love a framework that spells out a word.
Oh my God. This is the part that I am a little annoyed by. It's like, how much branding do we need?
I mean,
sure.
I appreciate it personally.
Sure.
It's hard to make these up. I can say from experience.
For sure.
And it does help you remember it.
No, it does. And this one is actually very, I think, excellent.
Yeah, it is excellent.
Yeah.
So the 7 braving all stands for braving. So boundaries, which is like you respect my boundaries, and when you're not clear about what's okay and what's not okay, you ask. And there's like a willingness to say no, like saying no is okay. Reliability. So you do what you'll say you do. You stay aware of your competencies and limitations so you don't overpromise, and you're able to deliver on commitments and balancing competing priorities. Also accountability. You own your mistakes. You apologize and make amends. Vault, which is you don't share information or experiences that are not yours to share. And I think really worth noting what this includes sharing with somebody information about somebody else that you are not in a position to share. Because I think it is very easy to fall into the trap of sharing information, sharing gossip in order to build connection.
Yeah, she says that's a very quick connection, but it's very fleeting.
Because people are going to wonder, like, so what are you going to tell everybody else about me?
What are you telling
Right.
everyone else that I told you that I didn't want you to?
So it's very short-lived. And I've been there. It can be really easy to fall into that trap. So
we seek acceptance in the tribe.
Yeah, it was definitely the quick, not ultimately satisfying way to build connection. Integrity, so you're choosing courage over comfort and what's right over fun, fast, or easy. Non-judgment, so feeling like I can ask for what I need and you can ask for what you need. We can talk about how we feel. We can ask each other for help without judgment. And then the G in it is generosity. So extending the most generous interpretation possible to the intentions, words, and actions of others. So this is like the more elevated version of assuming positive intent. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then she also noticed this is something that works for a relationship between two people. Like teams can also use this framework, and they can identify 1 or 2 observable behaviors for each of the 7 elements. And then you can also use it to work on your own self-trust and kind of evaluate.
Looks around uncomfortable.
I know. Be evaluating like how you did in a particular situation. So like, did I respect my own boundaries for this situation? Could I count on myself? Or am I like signing myself up to do something that I know I'm probably not going to succeed at? Like if you have ADHD time blindness, maybe awareness of that, she notes, right? Not ADHD, but having her own issues with estimating time. Did I hold myself accountable? Or did I blame others? Did I share or not share appropriately? Did I choose courage over my comfort and practice my values? Did I ask for help when I needed it without judging myself? Oh my God, that is hard. And did I treat myself with generosity and self-compassion?
No, and also no.
Right. This is all like we're all works in progress. Right. Yeah. So moving into the final part 4, which is learning to rise. So this is, I think, pulling largely from her book on resilience, but a lot of this is around like we can't expect people to be brave or risk failure if they're not prepared for what happens when they inevitably fail, right? And like she really emphasizes a lot of times companies do resilience training after there's already been a major crisis.
I've never been a part of resilience training.
Well, I've been in like companies where there was a merger happening and they were like, here's like training on how to manage change. And like, it did not help. First of all, they did it like, it was like day 3 of an offsite and it was 8 a.m. after a very long dinner and happy hour. So maybe right there, that was not the best strategy. But like also all of this comes down to how you frame it, right? And how your leaders are positioning it. She says like the most powerful tool for resilience is using some form of these sentence starters, which is the story I'm telling myself, the story I'm making up, or I make up that. And she tells us this whole story about a time with her husband where she was under a ton of work stress, a ton of deadlines that were coming up at once. And her husband had come home and opened the fridge and was like, oh, we don't even have like deli meat. And she instantly lit up and was like, oh my God, I'm already failing all these accounts. And he just wants to make sure I know that I'm failing on this as well.
Yeah, she went in the kitchen and she was like, I know what you're thinking. You come home and dinner's not on the table. And he looks at her and he goes, what's 30 times 365? And she goes, I don't, and now he's math shaming me. And no, he wasn't math. He's like, I don't know the answer to that, but we've been together 30 years. And in those 30 years, dinner has never been on the table when I've come home, and I'm the one that does the grocery shopping. She's like, okay, she calmed down. And she also talked about in this section, she starts to notice physiological changes that are her like bellwether of something's wrong. She's triggered, she's reactive, and she didn't pay attention to all of that. And finally, she told him the story I'm telling myself is like, I'm not good enough. You're sick of the stress. You're sick of all this. And he's like, okay, let me think about it. He's like, no, I'm just frustrated because I had a hard day and I came home and I'm hungry.
Yeah, he was hungry.
He was just hungry.
He's like, why did you say that? He's like, I was hungry.
I'm hungry.
But like, also, I this was another story. I'm like, oh, I relate to Brené.
Yeah.
I would totally do that.
Well, I do that. And that's the story. It's the story we're telling ourselves. And I think naming it and being able to stop and talk to your partner, certainly, or your team or your boss, that's probably useful in getting those cognitive distortions out in the open. And when you start naming them, when you put them in the sunlight, they don't have as much power.
Yeah, for sure. She's like, whatever it is, we all have these experiences where we make ourselves the center of something that actually has nothing to do with us out of our own fear and scarcity. And then we're like, oh, actually, that didn't actually have anything to do with me. So it's good to have that awareness for sure. So she ends the book with this 3-step learning to rise process. And the first one is the reckoning, which is basically like knowing when we're like emotionally hooked or like emotionally activated is usually what I call it, and choosing to get curious about it. Because most of us did not learn how to actually like slow down, take a deep breath, and get curious about what's happening when we're activated about something. Instead, we bust out our armor. And I really like these 6 strategies that we commonly use to offload our emotions onto others in these situations. Mm-hmm. So there's chandeliering, which is basically the case where somebody who's in a position of power just loses their mind. Like they flip out, they overreact, and because they're way less likely to be held accountable for it, and they can. And then this just results in everybody else walking on eggshells over time, right? Bouncing hurt, which is you're adopting a pose of indifference or stoicism, like deflecting with humor and cynicism. It's basically from a point of avoidance. And numbing hurt, which is back to numbing we talked about in the last episode too, right? It's like taking the edge off with whatever provides the quickest relief. Stockpiling hurt. So this is like you're not actually processing the hurt, you're just packing it down and
push it down. Stuff it down.
Amassing it, and then at some point your body has had enough and it comes up.
It'll be fine.
Yeah. And when she talks about like this comes up for a lot of people midlife or mid-career because our bodies can only take so much, right? So if you've been like stockpiling all of this and just trying to shove it down, you start to see the effects of stockpiled emotion at that point in your life. And that can show up as anxiety, depression, burnout, insomnia, and physical pain, which is so true. Again, like therapy, very useful, right? And then she also calls the next one the Umbridge, which is based on the character of Dolores Umbridge in Harry Potter. But this is like toxic positivity, right? This is like the everything is amazing. Everything is so good. I love all these like pretty things. But there's something like...
Yeah, but the dark side is she's torturing children.
She's torturing children, right? Yeah. So there's a dark side there, right? So there's this feeling of like, oh no, everything's amazing. Everything's so good. Something's off there, right? And then hurt and the fear of high centering. And she says, like, this reason for why we deny our feelings is this fear of getting emotionally high-centered, which is basically getting stuck in a way that makes it difficult to go forward or go backward. And you see this happen so many times, right? What if this dislodges something and I can't control myself anymore? And like I lose my control and I cry at work, right? So that feeling of like, I can't acknowledge this because I can't go backward or forward if I do.
Cry in the walk-in.
Cry in the walk-in. Oh, yeah, for me, it was like cry in the one single stall bathroom at work.
Those pods they have now and a lot of, you know what I'm talking about? Like those work pods where you can go in and make calls. They're really for sobbing. Well,
but most of them like are see-through. So you can see the person in there. Yeah. I mean, there should be cry rooms, right? I think there's... that's a whole
You shouldn't need that
thing
at work, but okay.
Sometimes you do, though. And sometimes there's other things happening in your life, and it all comes to head when you're at work.
Sure.
But her top tactic for regulating is actually box breathing, which is something you and I have talked about before.
Yeah.
I've used other variations of this, but this is basically the inhale through the nose for 4 counts, hold for 4 counts, exhale for 4 counts, hold the empty breath for 4 counts, and then start over again. So you're like breathing in a box, exactly what it sounds like, right? And it is a really good way. There's many breathing exercises you can use as a way to just regulate yourself in those situations. And then like slowing yourself when you find yourself emotionally activated, like slowing the conversation down, whether that's slowing how you're speaking, taking like a few breaths, recognizing you can take a pause, and then asking yourself in that pause, do I have enough information to freak out about this situation? And if I do have enough data, will freaking out actually help?
love this. I'm totally doing this.
Oh, I love it. I love it too. And then the next section is the rumble, which is like the second part of this learning to rise part, right? And most of what this is talking about is in the absence of data, our brains will always make up stories. And I thought this was interesting from like a neuroscience standpoint. She talks about like our brain rewards us with dopamine when we recognize and complete patterns, and stories are ultimately patterns.
Yeah, even if they're not true.
Even if they're not true.
That's why we jump to assumptions.
Yeah. So like when we explain something that happened by coming up with a story, a totally untrue story, like we will get dopamine from that. So like our brains are basically wired to do that. And that does not mean those stories are accurate. She talks about like the first story we make up is the SFD or the... You know, we're trying not to do like much cursing on this, but like when it's something that comes from the author or interviewee, in this case, it's the shitty first draft. Or she says like with kids, I call it the stormy first draft. The raw version of this is like all of our fears and insecurities romping all over the place, making up all these worst case scenarios where fear is just filling in all the gaps, like where we don't have information. And like these are also basically conspiracy theories because they're stories that are based on limited real data and a lot of imagined data blended into this coherent, emotionally satisfying version of reality. And our brains are really good at coming up with these, right? So she...
Just because I'm paranoid, it doesn't mean everyone's not after me. And then she also talks about confabulations, which is a
a lie told honestly, where you replace missing information with something false that we actually believe to be true. So these are things that we believe are factual information, but it's really just our opinion. I mean, I was like listening to a podcast like yesterday about like the Mandela effect. And I feel like you see this in a lot of cases where people are certain something happened where it's not actually what history says happened, right? All this stuff is so interesting.
I think there's a very small percentage of the population with like truly eidetic memories. Memory is not reliable.
Oh, no.
From a neurobiological standpoint, like when you remember something, you're not remembering the event. You're going to the place in your brain that's the point that the last time you remembered it. So it's a pretty fluid experience.
Very. Yep. So she talks about like, how do you move from this SFD to a true story? I really like that when something comes up, she'll do like an SFD on her phone real quick. And it's just the format for this is just, this is a story I'm making up. Here's my emotions, what my body's doing, my thinking, my beliefs, my actions, period. I was like, oh, I kind of want to try that next time. I'm like having a hard time getting over something, like something's really activating me. And then to move it from an SFD to an actual true story that you can do something about, asking yourself these 3 questions, which are, what more do I need to learn and understand about the situation? So like, what do I know objectively and what assumptions am I making? What more do I need to learn and understand about the other people in the story? Like, what additional information do I need? What questions or clarifications might help? And then what more do I need to learn and understand about myself, which is actually the hardest part, right? So like, what's underneath my response? What am I really feeling? What part did I play in this? And if you answer all of these, you can help go from this SFD that is like probably a lot of not actual reality into something that you can actually work with.
I think the key is what's underneath my response. What is going on under the surface? Like this is sometimes I find these exercises a little bit oblique to do in real life. But if you can get the crux of it, it's honestly, what am I afraid of? Fear is probably the motivator. What am I afraid of that's making me generate this cognitive distortion?
Yep. And then the last section, which is pretty brief actually, of these 3.
Surprisingly.
We'll talk about that. The revolution. So she talks about 3 things she learned from her research. The level of collective courage in an organization is the best predictor of their ability to be successful in terms of culture, to develop their leaders and meet its mission. The greatest challenge in developing brave leaders is helping them acknowledge and answer their personal call to courage. And we fail the minute that we let someone else define success for us. And then she talks about this importance. I think this was actually from The Gifts of Imperfection, which is her first book. But coming up with like a joy and meaning list and thinking through like when things are going really well in our family or team, what does it look like? What brings us the most joy? When are we in our zone? And then using it to actually define your success. And I thought this was cool because we actually have a list hanging on a refrigerator.
I think I got that from Gap and Gain.
Yeah, like from the Gap and the Gain, which is literally like when we are on a vacation, we defined what does success look like for our family, and we have it hanging on our fridge.
We do.
And it's kind of cool. I like it.
It's not one value, by the way, Brené.
No, it's not. And it's also like, are we defining your success based on what's on that list? No, that's a work in progress.
It's a work in progress, but it definitely helps to define your own success. And we'll do Dan Harding and his books at some point, but high achievers never think they're successful. Right? They're trying to reach some point where they'll finally feel like they're successful. That never happens. So the right verbiage is, I'm succeeding when I have my own list. I'm succeeding when at work. I'm succeeding when I prioritize my own mental, spiritual, and physical health over any external success or accolades. And that's a trigger for me because I want all those external. So, okay, that's not an end point, but I'm succeeding as the person I want to be when I'm doing that, which is almost never.
Well, believe it or not, everybody, we actually made it to the end of the book.
Okay. So,
our 2 questions that we ask for every book.
Kristen, what didn't resonate for you?
So I was actually like, I got to the end, almost to the end of the book, and I was like, having a hard time with this. Maybe like the word rumble was one I was thinking about, because like I don't super love it, as we mentioned. But I think actually what I ended with, there is so much packed into this book. So much amazing stuff, amazing tools and concepts. And then the ending itself is kind of abrupt, I found. Like it just has that last like revolution section. I think it could really use something that actually helps with, okay, now that you know all this, like what is a way to take in all this information and process it and actually like start working through it? I think there's maybe one mention of the resources on her website, which like are really good. So mentioning that again and like just giving more for people to actually like take this and put it into place, because there's so many things in here. You can't change everything at once, right? So I think just giving some guidelines and resources and ways that are like, here's a way that you could take all this and actually start putting it into place, or even pointing out for each section, like these are the exercises in the workbook that you can go to work on this, would be really helpful.
Sure.
So what about you?
For me, it was, I think the second part of the book is a bit, I don't want to say forced, but I think a little bit forced.
You mean like parts 2 through 4?
Yeah, a little bit, where we come up with the braving inventory. Okay, that all works and everything. I don't know that it's absolutely necessary. I think some of that is a natural progression from the beginning of the book, and authors tend to make, in my opinion, things longer sometimes than they need to be, because that's what sells, or that's what feels good, or you need a certain number of pages for your contract. And I'm not saying she did that, but I don't think it's as well researched as her whole, the thesis of this is shame, vulnerability, and courage. And then she's giving a couple like organizational tools, and they're good tools. I like them, but I don't think they hit home as well. And the part about the values, I don't think you can, I think it's a good exercise to like distill your values down. It's a little bit, for me, a bit of an oversimplification.
Yeah. That's fair.
But I have not written 6 New York Times bestsellers. So, I mean, overall, this book is so touching. It's so good.
Yeah.
It's so powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What was your most life-changing takeaway?
Well, I've read it twice, right? So the first time I remember was the rumble, right? And this concept of sitting there in the uncomfortableness. And I can tell you, I remember, I think I talked about it once before. I remember the first time that I used this concept. It was when I had to sit there and tell another like manager level person, like, your effort is not cutting it. Like, we're all running around 14 hours a day, and you're doing 7.5 hours and clocking out for lunch and being like, okay, I'm going home now. See you guys. And we're all like, I'm going to be here till midnight because and I had to sit there and tell him that I was not comfortable. And he was older than me. And so I was like, okay, I've got to sit here and rumble with them. So that was a really life-changing takeaway, being comfortable with that. The second time, I think my life-changing takeaway is that courage really is a teachable skill. It's a repeatable, teachable skill, and there's a step-by-step process. A lot of it is getting comfortable with your own feelings of inadequacy and all the other fears, and in the face of that, still like moving forward and teaching other people to do that. So that's pretty life-changing.
Nice.
Kristen?
And for me, I mean, there were so many things I could have picked, but I ended up going with shame and having a better understanding of shame as an emotion, and the idea that by talking about it openly, you're giving it less power. Like, I had a specific situation where, like, in the middle of reading this book, I was able to actually articulate that what I was actually feeling was shame about it.
Yeah.
And just saying that is very empowering, and it makes a lot of progress just by being able to recognize that. So I chose that because it's just made an immediate difference in the way I was approaching something. But I feel like I could read this many times and get something different each time.
I might change my answer. If I read it again, it'll probably be understanding the difference between shame and guilt. I don't think I've dug in enough to that because I have a lot of cultural cultural shame. And I got to dig into that more. But I think that's so powerful. And I'm going to explore that probably for the next decade. Strap in, get ready.
I'm ready.
You say that. We'll see about that.
All right. Well, we have made it to the end. Thank you guys for listening to these. These have been 2 long, meaty episodes, but I hope you've enjoyed being along on this ride with us. I do not expect we'll do this with that many books, but this was one that we just
it's not
really
even that
felt
long of a
was worth it.
Yeah, it's not even that long of a book.
It's not. It's
Yeah.
just, I feel like most books have more, I don't want to say fluff, but there's more, here's the idea and here's how you demonstrate it with a story or whatever. And like hers is just, there's so much packed
Because
in
she
there.
has so many decades of research, so many clinical studies from different disciplines that she's pulled together. It's
Absolutely.
It's backed by science.
Yep. Yeah.
Approved by the Love and Leadership Podcast. Trademark.
All right. So we are going to wrap here. Thank you guys so much for listening. We will be back next week with a brand new episode. And bye, everyone.
Goodbye. Thank you.
The Love and Leadership Podcast is produced and co-hosted by me, Kristen Sharkey, and co-hosted by Mike Sharkey. Please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. We can't stress enough just how much these reviews help. You can follow us on LinkedIn under Kristen Sharkey and Michael Sharkey, and on Instagram as Love Leader Pod. You can also find more information on our website, loveandleadershippod.com. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you again next week.